So here I'm back in the app.js file. In there, in the render method, which you learned is used when creating a component by extending the component object, there we output 3 persons. And this clearly is kind of a list, because we also have persons managed in our state here. It would make sense to output this as a list. But before we dive into that, let's dive into outputting content conditionally first. Let's say when we click this button, we don't really want to switch the names as we do right now, but let's say instead we want to show or hide the persons we have down here. For this, we can, for example, wrap all these persons in a div, let's say, so that in the end we can show or hide this div and automatically also show and hide everything that's inside the div. That's the idea behind wrapping all the persons with the div. So that's the first step. The second step now is that we need to change this method. I'll name it to toggle persons handler and will no longer pass an argument to this method. Now with that, I will go back to the old syntax of not using a function here, which returns another function call, but just passing a reference. I now also need to create a method called toggle persons handler. So I will add it here above the render method. And we could use both syntaxes. This syntax here, which will create a method. In here we will have problems if we want to use the this keyword though. And since we will call this method here upon an event fired in the DOM, this would lead to real problems. So I will use the other syntax of assigning an arrow function to a property. It will also create a method in the end. It's just a different syntax, and due to the internals of JavaScript, this makes sure that this keyword inside this method always, under all circumstances, returns to this class. So I recommend using this. Now in there, I now want to toggle some property, which in the end decides whether we want to display this div with the persons inside of it or not. So first of all, I'll go to my state and add a property. I'll name it show persons. The name, of course, is up to you. And I'll set it to false initially. Now, if it is false, I don't want to show the persons. And how can we now render this dynamically? Well, we can go to the div, and in other frameworks like in Angular or in Vue.js, you would now place a directive on this div. For example, in Vue.js, if you know that, we would have vif. Now, React works different. Here, always keep in mind, we are working with JavaScript only. It might look like HTML here, but it is JSX. It is just syntactical sugar for React create element. So in the end, here, we have JavaScript code. Hence, we can work with it as we can work with JavaScript code. If we want to render this dynamically, we can enclose it in single quotation marks, the whole div wrapping the persons, not the outer div, the inner div. And now, between the quotation marks you learned, you can write JavaScript expressions. That's not only true for 2+2 or for reaching out to the state, you can also render content conditionally by adding a ternary expression. What you can't do here is add an if statement. If something, then something. That looks like it would be the right solution to simply then move the div inside of the if block here, but this doesn't work. You actually can only use simple statements, no block statements, as part of this dynamic syntax. So between the opening and closing single curly brace. So using an if block like this will not work. But we can use a ternary expression. We can simply check if this state show persons. Keep in mind, this is a Boolean. We assign false initially. So this will give us true or false. And now a ternary expression, which is a default JavaScript construct, checks this condition by adding a question mark. And then we decide what to do if this is true. Well, if it is true, we want to output this div, right? So right now, the part after the question mark, so this div, gets executed if this is true. We also need to define an else case by adding a colon and then what we want to do if it's not true. This is null, which simply means render nothing. This might be looking super confusing the first time you use it. I am aware of this. So what we in the end do here is we simply take advantage of the fact that all we write here is in the end JavaScript. And we can interject JavaScript expressions into JSX with single curly braces. You learned that. This means we can of course access any JavaScript property and use it in a ternary expression. Again, this is a default JavaScript construct. A ternary expression is created by having some condition. This doesn't have to be a property. It could also be a check where we see if that is true. But since this is a boolean, it is automatically true or false, but this would be valid too. Then we have a question mark to separate our check from the what to do if true case. And this is this part here. Now, keep in mind, we're not writing HTML here. This is JSX. So in the end, we are calling React create element if this condition is true. We're not calling it explicitly. We're rendering this content, but you learned that this is converted to React create element behind the scenes. And then we have an else condition separated by a colon. This simply means if this check here is not true, then do this. And since we simply execute nothing here, we return null. It basically means we'll render nothing. It renders null, and that is nothing. This is how you may read this. Again, may look super strange, but makes perfect sense once you wrap your head around how JavaScript, how React actually works. It's all JavaScript. Now, with this, let's complete our logic by making sure that the toggle person's handler correctly switches the state. So we can simply set const does show, create a new constant in there, which is this state show persons. This is either true or false. It's the current state. And then we call this set state to adjust the state. And now here we simply set show persons equal to what does show is not by adding an exclamation mark in front of it. This simply converts it. If does show is true, it will set show persons to false. If does show is false, it will set show persons to true. And again, important, this gets merged with the other state. Set state with an object where we only set show persons does not mean that the entire state gets replaced with show persons only. The old state, persons and other state, simply is not touched. React merges the updated show persons value for us into this state. This is what's happening here. Now, with that in place, we should be able to save this code and make sure that npm start is running, and then head over to your running application. Over there, if you click switch name, you now see the persons. We get that warning we already got in the last value that for some of these persons we're not actually setting up two-way binding correctly. We can ignore it here though. Actually, it even is a good thing we get it here. It clearly shows us that React didn't hide the values before. Otherwise, we would have gotten this warning right at the start. When we reload the page, we don't get it. We only get it once you click the button. So React does really only render these elements once our condition is true. If I click again, it's hidden. Now, I can also confirm this by inspecting the DOM. If we take a closer look into our root element into the app, we see that button here, and below the button there's absolutely nothing. Now watch this part on the right here once I click the button. You saw this div blink up? This is this new div with our persons. It was really just added, rendered to the DOM, once the condition was true. This is how this works in React. Now I'll just update the caption of this button to toggle persons, but that's only a cosmetic change. We already got a working conditional check. Now, writing conditionals like this though does work, but can also lead to confusing JSX code if you have a lot of possibly even nested checks. So I will show you an alternative to this in the next lecture.